Before me there is no God formed, nor shall there be after me. Even I, am the Lord, and besides me there is no Savior. I declare and say, I proclaim, and there is no foreign God among you. Therefore, you are my witnesses. Father, let us be your witnesses today, throughout this coming. And let us all pray together the prayer that you gave us. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Children can be dismissed. Please wait by the door till we're all ready to go over. What? Oh.
Everything ready to go, Tally?
We are live.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Let me tell you a couple stories. Back around 1975, there was a pastor who started coming to the park in East Bloomfield and witnessing to people. And somehow my mother met up with him, and so he started coming and teaching a Bible study in our house on Thursday nights. And I had no interest in the Lord really in those days, but my interest began to be piqued a little bit. And so I would go on Thursday night to the Bible study, and then I would go out and do what I normally did when I went out. And for a short time, for about a year, I'd say, I learned from him. I started going to church, and then I went to his congregation and gave my heart to the Lord. That was in 1975. It took about a year before I actually made a commitment, but I was, kind of halfway involved in it. And when I went to him, I said, where should I go to Bible school? Because I had a calling on my life to be a pastor, and so he pointed me in the direction. When I went to Bible school and I came back the next summer, I learned that he had left his wife and he was leaving with a woman from the church. And I was there at the event when he was actually leaving. And I said to him, don't run away with this woman. And he said, I'm not leaving with her. I'm leaving. I'm going to do something. She's leaving. She's going to do something else. And we're not together, which was a lie. And I never saw him again. He disappeared. The husband of the woman that he left with moved to California. And one night, in the middle of the night, her husband called my mother and said, I'm working at such and such a hotel in LA or somewhere in California, and he checked into the hotel tonight. What do I do? The pastor, after like 2-3 years. So that was my first big disappointment with Christian leadership. And when I was in Bible school, this minister came from Louisiana named Marvin Gorman. Have you ever heard of him? He was a big time preacher in the South. And he came to our chapel and he preached and he had the students in tears. I can still remember what he preached on. He preached on loneliness and, had an altar call. People came forward and got prayer for their loneliness. And I thought to myself, this guy has really got what it takes. This guy's really following the Holy Spirit and he's doing well. Well, it turns out that in the midst of all of that, he was visiting prostitutes. And Jimmy Swaggart saw to it that he got defrocked. You know what Jimmy Swaggart is, right? Well, this was my second big disappointment with Christian leaders. So Marvin Gorman found out that Jimmy Swaggart was doing the same type of things that Marvin Gorman was doing, and since Marvin Gorman was turned in by Jimmy Swaggart, Marvin Gorman decided to get even with him. And so Swaggart was in a hotel with a prostitute, and Gorman went out and let the air out of the tires in his car. And when Swaggart came out, Gorman was standing there and saying, "What are you doing, Jimmy?" And then that whole thing blew up. That was my third disappointment. And there have been others. Just recently, Rabbi Zacharias, you know who he is? Probably the most brilliant apologist for the Christian faith that has certainly in the last century and this century. He could answer any kind of question that somebody would put to him. And it turns out that a couple of years ago, he was accused by somebody of doing something unseemly. And no, he couldn't have done that. He's too good of a person. And now they found out after his death, his organization gave somebody the authority to go in and to investigate it properly. And they found out that it was a pattern in his life. And so I don't know if you saw the repentance of the group that supported him, but that is a huge disappointment to me and to a lot of people, because who caused more people to blaspheme God than these folks? And of course, Baker with Jessica Hahn, same thing, that's all gone. And I never cared for Jim and Tammy Baker. I didn't like their show. I saw a video of Jim Baker preaching as a young man, and I can tell you he was a powerful preacher. But the money and the sex got to be too much for him. And these guys think that they can get away with it. I remember my Bible school professor saying, "You can't get away with it, because the woman will tell somebody. It might be her mother, it might be her father, it might be her best friend, it might be somebody on your church board, but she will tell somebody." And I always took that as a good piece of advice. I haven't had too much temptation in my life that way, but fortunately, and I've always respected my marriage vows from the beginning of my marriage until today. So I wanted to just mention that, because the prophet Samuel, at the end of his life and at the end of his ministry, he stood before the people and he said, "If I've defrauded anybody of any money, come forward now, I'll pay it back. And whose wife have I gone after? Or what have I done? What accusation is there against me? And bring it up now, and whatever it is, we'll fix it." And nobody could say a word, because Samuel had lived his life in an exemplary way. Not in a perfect way. He didn't raise his kids very well. But he didn't defraud the people or take their money or take their women or anything like that. Now, our passage today is a passage where Nehemiah defends himself, and if I can find the clicker. Let me just review. Nehemiah secures permission from the king of Persia to rebuild Jerusalem. His presence and work are not appreciated by the neighbors. The neighboring people conspire to kill the Jews and stop the work. The Jews are fearful and they arm themselves into a militia to protect themselves. They had a troublesome problem with the enemy, and they had a problem with creditors and debtors. I want to just mention, and I have mentioned this before, that the book of Nehemiah is a compilation work, just like the Gospels. Why are the Gospels different? In the early days of Christianity, one of the apostles would come into the church and they tell a story about Jesus. And somebody would write it down. And then maybe Peter would come and he'd tell a story of something that happened when he was with Jesus. And so there were these groups of Christians in different places. And when the early apostles came, they told stories, and the stories were put together as a compilation into the Gospels. That's why they differ a little bit from one another, because they were how the story was heard in different places. Now, Nehemiah starts out with how he was sent by the king to do the job. And then we get to chapter 5, and there's a story of the debt, and then there's a story about what we're going to talk about today. But if you look at chapter 4, verses 22 and 23, the next verse really is chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Let me read it. I said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night in Jerusalem, so they may be on guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers or my servants or the men of the guard who followed me ever took off our clothes, and each kept his weapon in his hand. And when it was reported to Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies, see, the story just flows. There's other examples of that too in the Bible. The story of Balaam and his ass. If you read the story, how he is called by the foreign king to curse Israel, and you get to the end of that, and then the story of the talking donkey is in the middle. If you take the last verse before that and the last verse after the fable about the donkey, then they go together. It's something that's been placed in there. So chapter 5 is like that in Nehemiah. And we'll see in the weeks ahead that there are some writings that Nehemiah found, some records that he found, and he put them in the book there. So I want to talk about this narrative that at the end, after the wall is built and after everything is done, he looks back and he talks about what we talked about last week about the problem with the debt and the creditors, and also this little passage today. Moreover, from the time I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of the King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. So we see in Nehemiah chapter 1 that it was the 20th year of that king where he went. Now we're in the 32nd year. So here, this is placed into the story where everything that he did is accomplished. It's done. His governorship is actually over at this point. And he's looking back and he begins to tell the story, which is basically a justification of himself and a justification of himself, and he's telling them what his philosophy of ministry was during that time period. So it's not in the right place. We think chronologically, and Jews have traditionally in many places thought chronologically. Have you ever heard of the book of Chronicles? You can't get more chronological than that. And the genealogies in Genesis and different places, those are chronological. But if you look at the stories, say in 1 Samuel or in 1st or 2nd Chronicles, you'll see that they're not in chronological order. They're a group of writings that have been put together by an editor somewhere, and they were thought to be a valid inspiration so that people could discuss what happened in those times and how that might apply to their lives, which is really the purpose of the Bible anyway, to lead us to Jesus. So we see that this is a recapitulation. The story is finished even though we haven't finished the story. The former governors, and I can't see that very well, it's a woman with a big burden on her back. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took food and wine from them, besides 40 shekels of silver. And this is really the harshest verse in the whole thing. Even their servants lorded over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. Now, we'll see later in a few weeks, he was not a perfect guy. I mean, he had his issues, just like everybody has their issues. But his basic philosophy was, he was willing, even though he's the governor, he was willing to live as the people lived. My same professor that I mentioned before, he said to us one day, if you eat macaroni, I eat macaroni. If you eat steak, I eat steak. And what he was saying is that you should not live above the people in the church, whatever level they're living at, you should live at that level. And that's exactly what Nehemiah did. He had the opportunity to take lots of wealth. And don't most politicians end up rich? How do they do that? I mean, yeah, they make a really good salary, but they also spend a lot of money on stuff. They fly around the world and so forth. And so there are ways that politicians can make themselves rich, can make their children rich, and have all kinds of stuff. But Nehemiah said, I didn't do that. I didn't take the food. I didn't take the silver. My servants that are here did not lord it over the people who we came to serve. We lived like they lived, and we served like they served. That's a pretty bold statement, I think. Of course, Jesus said this, take my yoke upon you, learn from me. I'm gentle, humble in heart. You'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy. My burden is light. Yes, they had trouble. Yes, they had financial trouble. Yes, they were in fear for their lives. Yet they still did the work of God. And so the burden of Jesus is a light burden. And Nehemiah did not want to make that burden any heavier on the people. And so he didn't use his privilege, so to speak, to lord it over them. Indeed, I devoted myself to the work on the wall. I acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. He showed up for the work day. He rebuilt a section of the wall just like everybody else rebuilt a section of the wall. The difference was that he was over the whole plan, but that just because he was the general contractor for the whole thing, he felt that it was important to show that he was actually working with them to accomplish it. And so this is kind of an important thing in servant leadership. You know, somebody once said, what do pastors do? Well, sometimes they clean the toilet. They do. I've cleaned the toilet. Toilet needs cleaning. Sometimes they pick up around. Sometimes they do things that you don't ever hear about or ever even know about. And so Nehemiah had this kind of attitude that he was one of the people. Now, he didn't have this problem with sexual sin because he was a eunuch. You know, if you served in the king's court in Persia in ancient times, they snipped you. And so he didn't have a wife, and so he didn't have the temptation of women. But the other temptation was certainly there, the temptation of wealth and power and greed and so forth. Those were there. So his servants worked. He worked just like they worked. Now, if I were to tell you stories, I've been here 30 years. I can tell you stories from 1990, and I can tell you stories from 1994, and I can tell you stories from 1998, and I can tell you stories from 2005. And if you came over to my house and you wanted to talk about the history of the church, I would tell you something, but I wouldn't tell you in chronological order. I would say something, and then so there would be some conversation. I said, well, yeah, but before that, this is what happened. And that's kind of like what we're getting here, because in the previous few verses, we have a famine and no money and all of this stuff. But in this verse, it's a different time. It's obviously a later time because they got things back in order. And he says that I served 150 people. That means daily. Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations around. And he's saying here that he did it with his own money. He didn't dip into the coffers of the king of Persia, the Iranian king. He served these people. When somebody would come from a neighboring place, he would serve them food. And the Jews that were around there and had some authority, he would feed them. But also, there was a greater need for food as well. That which was prepared for one day was 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, also fowls. We don't know if they were chickens or ducks. Were prepared for me every 10 days. Might have been geese. Skins of wine. How's that for your theology? In abundance. Yet with all this, I did not demand the food allowance of the governor because of the heavy burden of labor upon the people. Can you imagine what it would cost to buy 6 sheep? This is obviously, he's feeding all the people when they're working on the wall. When they're in Jerusalem, when they're spending the night, he's providing the food. It's a different time. It's not what we had in the previous verses where nobody had anything and people were starving. It's after a while, and he's providing everything they need, not just a meal of creamed broccoli on toast, but good meat, backstrap, and all kinds of stuff for the people. And he says, and I didn't take the allowance that was given to me, because if I took the allowance that was given to me, it would be extracted from the people that I was feeding. They would actually be feeding themselves instead of me feeding them. So he had some really great qualities, even though he was an angry guy. Maybe he had right to be angry. A dispute arose among them. That's the disciples of Jesus. Which one of them was to be regarded the greatest? And Jesus said, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. We're just here to help. They're called benefactors. But they're actually lording it over them. Oh, we're here to serve the people. But they're really serving themselves. They're called benefactors. That's a euphemism. But not so with you. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest. You know, in our culture, that doesn't really mean. The youngest had to serve the older brothers. In that culture, the oldest brother was the one that was in charge in the family. For who is greater, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? Is not the one at the table? I'm among those who serve. When I was in India one time, we went to the home of a doctor in Hyderabad, which is basically a Muslim city. And we got to the door, and there in that culture, if you wore your shoes in church, you would, oh, how dare you, how disrespectful. They always take their shoes off at the door, and they don't bring the dirt of the street into the sanctuary, and they don't bring the dirt of the street into the house. They have slippers in the house, so as soon as you get there, you take your shoes off and you put on the guest's slippers. And I came into the doctor's house, and this poor little woman came and took our shoes and polished them. I was flabbergasted. Anybody want to polish my shoes? Now, the night that Jesus was betrayed, only John tells this, that after dinner he took the towel and he wrapped the towel around himself and he got on the floor and he washed the disciples' feet. And that's basically the context of the passage that I just read to you, where the greatest is the servant of all. And that's really what Nehemiah was. He was the servant of the people. And he took a lot of crap from the people around, and he took a lot of false accusations, and he overcame it. And he, in the midst of it all, he didn't take the money, didn't take his salary. I think that's me doing that. Maybe not. And then, just like two other places where we have already seen, in the midst of his discussion, he prays. Says, God, is it because I'm walking around that it's doing that? Or don't?
Probably because it's not close to your mouth, so I have volume up, so it's getting feedback.
Okay, turn it down a little. Is that better? Okay, sorry, why didn't you tell me that before?
Yeah, didn't want to hurt you.
So in the midst of it, he prays to God. He doesn't ask them for anything. He doesn't want them to say, oh yeah, you're the greatest leader ever, anything like that. He says to God, remember for my good, oh my God, all the things that I've done for this people. So this is kind of a benediction to his life, even though it's stuck in the middle. You know, what was the purpose of sticking it in the middle? I mean, obviously some editor did that. There were different writings of Nehemiah, and whoever put it together, maybe it was Ezra, because they think that Ezra was the one that compiled the Old Testament at this time. Maybe for some reason he put it in the middle there. I would have put it at the end if I was the editor. What have you learned, or what strikes you from this? And we'll hear from you. Dale has the mic. Anyone? Yes.
I think it just makes a good point to, unfortunately, think that we don't want to think about all these people that are representing other groups of people, especially, not even politicians, but also even just like managers and things. They're getting paid more, and is that really necessarily helping everyone feel the same, or is it making it so that you're constantly jealous of this person and you have respect for them because they're above you, but then you also think of them as above you, and is that going to really affect on how we interact with them?
It could. It could. And then what would Jesus do? Gene's always good for a comment.
So part of the training I had when I was a manager was, there's two basic type of managers. One manager is the guy that's pushing everybody, push. The other manager is the guy that pulls, because he's doing it too. And I see Nehemiah as being the pull manager. He's not pushing them. He's doing it, and he's saying, do this. So that came out to me when you were talking about the fact that he's out there doing the building of the wall as well.
Yeah, how can you ask somebody to do something that you're not willing to do yourselves? same professor I mentioned previously said there are some things you have to earn the right to preach. And, you can't preach giving if you're not a giver, and you can't preach, servant leadership if you're not a servant. My father said the only thing that you need to earn is the right to wear a beard, and I think I've earned that right. So have you, Gene. You got the nicest beard in the whole place, but your wife probably doesn't like it. Is that yes, you don't like it?
No,
Or
I do like it.
anyone else? You got a little extra time today, that's good.
I've been doing a lot of reading on like the Civil War recently, and all the defeats on both sides always have a very interesting thing that cost them. And it almost always is the upper leadership asked something of the army that they couldn't do. And the colonels and the lower leadership all knew that they couldn't do it. And so when you have leadership that isn't participating in what has to be done, it can all be avoided. If you're there climbing the, you're looking at a piece of paper and you say, okay, get these 100 cannons up the mountain by 6 o'clock on paper, you think, oh, that can be done. And then it doesn't get done, which then is a chain reaction that causes the defeat of the battle. So Nehemiah seems like a good leader that wouldn't get caught in such a crowd.
Interesting thought. Anyone else? Do you ever wonder why, when I'm on vacation, I still come to church?
Well, why?
I hope that when you're on vacation and you're away, I hope you go to church somewhere. Anyone else?
Your opening comments with disappointments in Christian leaders. I think that, the higher up that Christian leader is, the more influence and visibility they have, the harder they're under attack every day. And, they're still human. God uses anyone to further his kingdom. And every human's going to fail. You just see it with those high leaders. So it's going to happen. It's going to continue to happen. And all you can do is just hope that God is able to use them to further his kingdom.
It hurts so many people when that happens, though.
Sure.
In the case of the first example I gave of the pastor who led me to the Lord, my brother didn't go to church for years after that. And he eventually, went back, and he's been an important person in his church for many years, but it was a long time before he could even trust anybody. And it's so common. Do you remember the guy, those of you who have been here longer, there was a guy named Kenny, a great, big, huge black guy. You remember him coming?
Yeah.
And his wife, he was a pastor in Minneapolis. And he was just infectious to be around. He was, happy and praise the Lord. And he told me that he was the illegitimate son of a preacher. And that he had brothers by a different mother. And it was before they could check DNA, but he knew that he was related to these brothers by a different mother because all the boys were born with 6 fingers on each hand, like Goliath. And they had, surgically removed the extra finger. But that's how everybody knew that he was actually the child of that preacher. Now, but to what Riley was saying, there's grace in that. But if you fall in that kind of thing, if you get greedy, or if you get like Jimmy Swaggart or Marvin Gorman, so many people are offended and are lost by that. One of the biggest preachers in Indiana had a problem, and he survived it, and has written some books and stuff. So yes, there is grace at the end of it, but it's difficult.
One of the things that's mentioned in the New Testament, when Jesus sent his disciples out, it's mentioned again in the disciple, it's not enough to be innocent. What Jesus told his people is, you have to be blameless. And in the writings, when you read Thessalonians, it talks about that you need to be holy and blameless. Well, being blameless is what we should be striving for, not just being innocent. It's not enough not to do it. Your life should be lived in such a way that nobody can blame you for it. You shouldn't have to prove your innocence.
They will blame you, though.
They will blame you, but you should live your life so that you're blameless, that there's no grounds for them to blame you. And that's difficult. That's very difficult.
Anyone else? Good conversation this morning. Being around in ministerial groups, I know a lot of pastors, and I know 50 pastors that have lived their life blamelessly. But in the groups, sometimes there'll be a person who goes to one of the other churches, and they talk about their glory years when they used to be a pastor. And the reason that they're not a pastor anymore is because they failed in this type of thing. And there's something in their heart, they've been destroyed by it, actually, because they've lost their calling, and they don't feel like they're of any value anymore. And it's really sad for a person that gets involved in this. Fortunately for Rabbi Zacharias, he died before it all came out. Anyone else? Well, how's that for a pep talk? The Bible's not all pep talk. The Bible is interesting stuff. And the nice thing about doing a verse by verse is you cover things you would never cover if you're just picking things out. Anyone else? Okay. A big blessing upon you. Have a great day. If you're online, like the video so other people see it.